Get started. We are recording. There we go. Recording has started. Good evening. My name is Danielle Swift, and I am a member of CMEJ and your facilitator tonight. So thank you all for being here. It's great to see you virtually. And we hope to have an interesting conversation around zoning and what that means for us here in Minneapolis. We're having this meeting because we are trying to influence the zoning code changes that are going to be coming up in Minneapolis for the first time in a while. And so we think that it's very important that community members be involved and be informed. And this is just a way for us to learn together because we're all learning at the same time. And so that we can be influential in what's happening in our community and our city. And so thank you all for being here. This is hosted and presented by CMEJ, which is Community Members for Environmental Justice. And our organization was founded in 2018, and I would be completely remiss to not shout out the co-founders, Roxanne O'Brien and Shalini Gupta, who are both on this call. So shout out to y'all. Thank you so much for the work that you do. And thank you for creating an organized space for us to do something about environmental justice. Woo. And, you know, we want to give a little bit of background about what CMEJ does. And I'm a newer member. So thankfully, we've got Justice Jones on the call who is here, and she's going to give us a little bit of background about CMEJ and the work that we do. Go ahead, Justice.
Didn't see I was muted. Thank you, Evan. Hello, everyone. My name is Justice. This is what I look like. My camera is a little bit weird and sometimes it goes in and out, so I'm just going to turn it off. Yeah, so CMEJ is an organization that the letters stand for Community Members for Environmental Justice. It's a coalition of caring community members, mothers, and youth who are committed to addressing environmental injustices happening disproportionately in pollution-burdened neighborhoods. So that would include North Minneapolis, which is where we're based. We're focused on organizing to push for government policies and decisions that reduce the levels of toxins and other issues that get identified by the community that affect community health overall. In the last year, we've done quite a few projects. We work with climate justice and EJ policy, like I mentioned. We also try to do climate emergency preparedness. We've come out with, I call them bug out bags, but it's something for emergency preparedness, making sure that you have all the supplies and materials that you need in case of an emergency, survive for at least 2 days. And then we also focus on community healing with Jerome May's Garden and healing with community influence. So yeah, that's a little bit about us.
Thank you, Justice. I think it's also important to mention how many of us are volunteers. And so shout out to those who are doing the work and doing it because it's important and because their passion fuels them. And so many of us are women and mothers and women of color. And so shout out to the matriarchs, y'all. You know, I'm definitely humbled to be a part of this work with such a fantastic team. So thanks again for being here. So we wanted to learn about how zoning has been used to create what we see in our communities. You know, when we talk about environmental justice, we have our natural environment and we also have our created environment. When we live in a city, there's nothing that's happening by accident. Things happen that way because they are designed that way, because they are planned for that way. And so it's important that we think about what's happening in our created environment in that context, right? These are decisions that are being made. So we want to see how segregation is created, how development patterns and concentration of industrial pollution show up in our neighborhoods, because that's by design. We also want to get an understanding and an idea of how zoning is present in our everyday life, right? So sometimes it feels like this big macro idea, but it really does affect us on an individual everyday level. And so really kind of getting a grasp on that as well. Like I mentioned earlier, There's going to be some rewriting of the zoning code in Minneapolis, and we're prepping to show up at the public hearing that's going to be happening in March, and give some information so that we all can participate in the public comment portion of that process. And yeah, and to learn from some of our neighboring cities, even if they're from afar, which is why we have brought in the brilliant Anna Baptista, PhD, and she's going to be here as a special guest tonight with us. And I'm just going to introduce Anna, and we'll just jump right in, okay? So Dr. Anna is an associate professor in the Environmental Policy and Sustainable Management program at the New School University. She is also the co-director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School, where she leads collaborative environmental justice research. She was previously the director of environmental justice for the Ironbound Community Corporation in her hometown of Newark, New Jersey. So not our exact neighbor, but a neighbor nonetheless. Anna works directly with environmental justice organizations on a range of issues, including cumulative impacts, local and state EJ policies, climate justice, and zero waste. Anna serves on the New York City panel of climate change and is a trustee for the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, Ironbound Community Corporation, Global Alliance for the Incinerator Alternatives, and the Victoria Foundation. So please welcome Anna, and we will go ahead and jump into our presentation for tonight. Thank you.
Real quick, make sure that your mics are off so that we don't have any extra noises, y'all, so we can hear everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Danielle, for that very kind introduction. I'm very honored that I have the opportunity to present a little bit about what I know about zoning and what I've learned along my own journey through environmental justice. And I'm still learning a lot, especially from communities who are really, battling it out and struggling to wrestle control of their land use and their zoning, and seeking environmental justice through their local land use planning and policy. So, yeah, and I'm grew up in Newark, and as a kid saw multiple fights at the zoning and planning board. Some of the craziest stuff I've ever seen was at planning and zoning board hearings, where residents would come out in force to really show their dissatisfaction with the way things were happening in communities, especially the way that industry just kept dumping on our neighborhoods. So I was always curious about zoning, and later in life I had the opportunity to come back home to live in Newark and study for my PhD in urban planning. So I got to learn a lot about urban planning and zoning. But to be honest with you, even though I went to school for urban planning, a lot of what I really learned about zoning and planning, I learned from being in community. Honestly, from showing up at all of those planning board and zoning board hearings and seeing the ins and outs of how that works or doesn't work. Taught me a lot more than I could have ever learned in a classroom. So I'm going to try to combine a little bit of what I learned from school and what I learned from being in Newark, dealing with zoning a lot on the ground, and sort of try to walk through why zoning is so important for environmental justice for many communities. And I think we'll have lots of time, hopefully at the end, where we can have questions and anything. If there's anything I'm talking about that is confusing, or maybe I'm not being clear, please feel free to ask questions in the chat and raise them as we go. So why are we talking about zoning? One of the most, my students really think it's super boring. So I was joking around. I'm going to try not to bore people to death today with zoning talk. But what I try to tell my students is zoning is one of the most, if not the most powerful tool that besides their literal police force that municipalities or local governments have. It is an extension, actually, zoning is an extension of police power. And it regulates basically almost everything that happens or gets developed in a city. And so we often, I know I did, take for granted what's in the zoning because it's super technical, hard to understand and decipher. It's usually in the hands of a very few set of folks inside City Hall. And honestly, they don't want you to know what they're doing with their zoning because it is so powerful. But you know who knows? Developers and real estate people. They know zoning in and out. And so that's when I realized, the true power of zoning is like, we have to become our own experts in this area so that we can wrestle that control back. And the reality is that a lot of zoning in America, in the US, has taken the form of racial zoning. And like, what's racial zoning? I'm going to talk about what zoning is, but like racial zoning is really the way that local governments have used the power of zoning to basically exclude and discriminate against people of color, and have accrued wealth and property value to whiter, wealthier neighborhoods and communities. And there are many, many studies throughout the country that have shown these patterns of racial zoning, where, for example, very stable African-American communities were downzoned from residential to industrial zones, or where affluent white suburbs completely outlawed or excluded people of color or higher density or low income housing. So racial zoning is a particular type of zoning that's been very virulent in this country, and continues to actually exert itself in maybe less explicit ways because that's been outlawed, but still shows up in some forms. So just a little bit of history. Some people call zoning, there's a different types of zoning, but the most common type is Euclidean zoning. They call it Euclidean zoning, and people think, oh, does it have to do with geometry? No, it has to do with a famous court case, actually. So the first appearance of zoning shows up in 1916 in New York City. And the Fifth Avenue merchants have this fancy Fifth Avenue real estate with all the fancy shops on Fifth Avenue. And
over to the basement, run out the back door.
Sorry, Karen, can you please mute your mic? Thank you.
And those Fifth Avenue merchants did not want the nearby garment workers coming into their shops, and really, they didn't want them mixing with their high-end clientele. So they went to the Board of Commissioners in New York City and said, we want to adopt some rules about how close factories can be to our commercial district. And voila, you have the first citywide zoning ordinance in the country for a major metropolitan area. And on the surface of it, it was to parse out and separate commercial and manufacturing uses, but it wasn't just that, right? It was also a way to separate out people. And in fact, that's what a lot of zoning does. And in 1926, the Supreme Court upholds the power of zoning, because zoning was very controversial back then, and it still is today, because individual property owners complain that, oh, when you impose these rules about where certain developments can go, you're taking away my property value. And so they went all the way to the Supreme Court in this case of Euclid versus Ambler, where a company wanted to start building industry in a residential area. And the city of Euclid said, no, Ambler company, you can't build your industry near our residences because you're going to deteriorate our property values and our quality of life. And they went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with the town and said, you can impose zoning rules as an extension of your police powers as long as they're quote unquote reasonable. And reasonable meant that it has something to do with maintaining the general public welfare and public health and safety of a community. Of course, like many laws, these laws get used and manipulated for other purposes. And what zoning essentially was used for was also not only to segregate land uses, but to segregate communities. And many communities throughout the country used racial zoning and other tools like racial covenants, but explicit racial zoning that said Black families couldn't move into a block that was majority white. That was a case in Baltimore, for example. Or, you couldn't, you basically couldn't introduce, Black, Jewish, whatever the ethnic minority was, into particular neighborhoods that were white. So this was used all over the country to harden racial segregation in communities. And many of these communities were previously actually integrated and became much more segregated through racial zoning. So even though the Supreme Court outlawed racial zoning and racial covenants are when individual homeowners would write specifically into their deeds that they did not, you couldn't sell the property to a person of color. And the Supreme Court outlawed that, but racial zoning continued because towns found ways around those explicit racial covenants and racial zoning laws. And so we had the Fair Housing Act that was enacted in 1968. Okay, so taking you on a whirlwind tour of the history of zoning. Now, a lot of planners, when I went to school, they told me, oh, zoning is a wonderful thing. It's really beneficial. It was meant to be welfare enhancing and good for public health because it parses out and separates land uses like, industries should be separated from residences. So it's a good thing, but it begs the question of who gets to decide, the public benefits of that, right? Who gets to determine what the parameters are of those land use divisions? Other folks suggest that actually zoning and land use planning in many forms are really just a way to protect private property values. And they're a means really for capital accumulation and real estate profit making. And regardless of what you think the original intent is of zoning, the use of it over time has been to, in some instances, harden and codify racial segregation, even when there's race neutral applications of it. But in practice, zoning basically sets out how large a lot can be, how tall a building can be, how much parking can go on a lot. It dictates whether the area is meant for residential, commercial, industrial, and it usually follows a general scheme, which is like, it goes from less intensive to more intensive. So R1 is a residential area that's typically single family home, so the least intensive density, right? And it can go all the way, like in Minneapolis, I think it goes all the way to R6, where you can have residential units that are multi-units up to 6 apartments or more, which is more intensive, more dense. So usually the higher the number, the more intense the land use, right? And there's, I don't know, you probably all know about this, but there's this University of Minnesota did this study called Mapping Prejudice, and it maps out, really interestingly, they went through, hundreds of records to look at where the racial covenants were for homes in Minneapolis neighborhoods. And they found, of course, that the areas in red where there were lots of racial covenants continued to be predominantly white communities today in Minneapolis. So you can see the effect that, even 50, 60 years ago, even though we outlawed racial zoning, the effects of that continue to show up in our communities today, right? That doesn't just go away just because the Supreme Court outlawed it. And there's some more really interesting maps about the effects of things like putting highways through Minneapolis that separate communities, destroy stable Black neighborhoods, right? And isolate communities. That certainly happened in Minneapolis. There's, I guess, a whole study on the Route 35 effects of that through communities. And there's some really interesting evidence of redlining, which is what happened when the federal government said, we're going to give out mortgages, low cost government backed mortgages to people, but wait, you can't be Black, you can't access those mortgages if you're Black. And it excluded many people from access to those mortgages, and it basically created a rating system for every neighborhood and said, if you're in a green area, you are a low risk for mortgage default and you're going to get a mortgage. But if you're in a red area, it's hazardous. And it had nothing to do whether or not you could pay your mortgage. It had all to do with your race. So areas shaded in red were considered hazardous, right? So these are all the different ways that land use shapes our communities and shapes our environmental justice conditions today. And this is all codified in zoning and land use law over time. Okay, so just a little bit of 101 on what is zoning exactly. As I said before, it really is a way that municipalities direct development within their borders, right? And basically it's designed on a map and a text. It divides the areas into residential, commercial, or industrial districts. At least sometimes it goes beyond that. Like for example, in New York City, we have maritime industrial zones, we have port industrial zones, we have lots of different types of zones. But you at minimum would have residential, commercial, and industrial. Sometimes you have mixed use zones. Usually what happens is a municipality has a comprehensive or master plan that lays out the vision of what the community or the city wants in terms of future development for its city. And then the zoning is basically the rules that can help implement that master plan. So first you usually have a comprehensive or master plan, and then you put into effect an ordinance or zoning regulations that can sort of lay the groundwork, the foundation for achieving that master plan. So the master plan is the vision, the zoning are the rules, right? So oftentimes we pay a lot of attention to the master planning process, which is great visioning and it's important, but we have to pay even more close attention to the nitty gritty of the rules because that sets the terms for what development can come into communities. So, and then like as I said, zoning usually has two parts. Usually has a map. So usually you have a map and you see all the different districts that are coded in different colors. And I think I have one here of Minneapolis, but I don't have the latest zoning map for Minneapolis. And then there's a text that accompanies the map that explains the rules of the map. And the text usually explains like what rules apply in each district. Like if you're in a residential zone or district, what rules apply to you if you want to build a house or you want to make additions to your house, right? And the procedures for administering those rules. So, and some of the basic rules are like, for example, the setbacks, the parking, the intensity of the use. So for example, in an industrial district, it might tell you the types of manufacturing that can happen in those districts, right? So you'll see in the text for each district, what are the lists of permitted uses, conditional uses, and prohibited uses in each district. And I'm not going to go through all these terms because they're super boring, but maybe I'll touch on a few. So for example, a permitted use would be something that is the principal use that is allowed in that district. So if you're in a residential district, you would assume that you're allowed to build, if you're in an R1 area, that's a low intensity residential area, a single family home in that area. But if you wanted to build like a high-rise apartment building in an R1 zone, that might not be permitted because that intensity might be not allowed in that district. So if it's a permitted use in that district, then it's usually allowed by planning boards, like so almost de facto, right? If it's a conditional use, it means there may be certain standards that if you meet them, you can be allowed in a district. it's usually like there's some discretion there that cities have. And there's usually some consideration of like, what are you mitigating? What impact are you mitigating in those conditions? And then there's like prohibited uses, which is like things you outright can't do in that district. And I'll just mention another term you may be hearing, upzoning and downzoning. That just means like, is your area like going from a high intensity to a low intensity or vice versa? Like if you're in a single family area, like a zone that's zoned for residential 1, which is single family homes, and the city decides to make your area a commercial zone or a mixed use zone, all of a sudden you may be going up to a higher intensity. It allows many different types of uses, so it's higher. So you're being upzoned. All right. In many cases, Black communities around the country, certainly in New York and New Jersey, where I am, many African-American communities were downzoned. When we had stable African-American communities, cities would come in and allow those residential districts to become industrial over time and allow the incursion of polluting industries in those areas that nobody else wanted, that they considered degraded land areas. And so over time, they started to concentrate all the industries in what were residential districts. And we see there's all these studies that have shown that happen in many EJ communities. Now,
I have a question though. How does that, isn't that going to fall under non-conforming use?
well,
Like allowing things like an industrial district to becoming a residential district, isn't that non-conforming?
back then it was not. So what cities did was they rezoned residential areas to industrial areas so that industries could be introduced to residential areas, not as non-conforming, but as conforming uses. So actually residences where people lived and had lived for a long time became non-conforming. The industries were conforming and the residences were getting pushed out or devalued. And that was, again, how a lot of EJ communities became blighted, because their presence in those zones became almost, as you said, non-conforming. In some cases, the downzoning happens through mixed use, right? They'll say you can have industry and residences close together. Again, creating land use conflicts and impacts on local residences, but it also devalues land in many of those communities. So I'm going to keep going here. Let's see. So I'll just mention a few other terms that are important here. Things like exclusionary zoning and inclusionary zoning. So exclusionary zoning is a type of zoning that basically restricts certain types of uses that can be built in a community. And many wealthier, whiter suburbs used exclusionary zoning to outlaw, for example, industrial uses in their borders. And they would have things like a minimum lot size of an acre. Like if you wanted to build a home in one of the suburbs, you had to have at least an acre. And who can afford an acre? Very few people. So it was a way to exclude multifamily housing, senior living, affordable housing, many of the uses that you just can't conform to, single 1 acre lots, was a way to de facto discriminate against people. So you no longer use race, now you use income or these tools and tricks of zoning to keep out uses that you didn't want. And cities, meanwhile, are increasingly applying what we call inclusionary zoning. And they're looking at ways that they can mandate or incentivize the inclusion of affordable housing in any new development and encourage, more mixed income neighborhoods that increase affordability. So Newark passed an inclusionary zoning ordinance that was very hard fought. So I don't know if Minneapolis has that, but it's something that's growing. I'm gonna just mention, so zoning got us into this mess in some ways of environmental injustice and environmental racism. But I wrote this report back in 2018 to say, okay, if zoning got us into this mess, how can zoning help us get out of it too? How can we use the power of zoning and land use planning to help EJ communities? And back in 2017, 2016, I was working with folks in Newark to try to pass a cumulative impacts ordinance, an EJ ordinance at the municipal level. And folks from Chicago out in Little Village and other EJ communities in Chicago were like, hey, can you help us? We're trying to do something similar, and our city planners tell us it's impossible, it can't be done, you can't use zoning to do that. And so I partnered up with the folks in Chicago and some of the folks they were working with at NRDC there to do this snapshot study across the country of what are the land use and zoning tools that communities are using and are enacting that could be used to try to advance environmental justice. And so we sort of tried to create like a toolbox of like all the different things you could try to promote or have been tried by communities on the ground. And we found 40 policies, 23 cities, 3 counties, even public utilities like the San Francisco Water Authority, who were promoting different land use and zoning approaches to EJ. Of course, this is not exhaustive. There's a lot more that we didn't uncover, but we tried to focus on the ones where there was some push from EJ advocates or some, interest in pushing, pushing their environmental justice laws further through the local land use processes. And generally, like I won't get into all of these, but these are just some of the categories of policies. If you look at the report, you can actually click on the links and it takes you to the actual language of the ordinance or the bill or the policy. But there are like communities like Chicago that outright banned certain uses or created prohibited uses because they had this problem with petcoke piles and manganese piles that were impacting neighborhoods. So they banned that outright in their zoning code. They made that a prohibited use. Then you have like general EJ policies like Fulton County, Georgia. They had a blanket EJ policy that applied to every municipality in Fulton County. And it required that all of the agencies working with EJ communities incorporate some of the EJ goals that they put in their plans. Then we had environmental review processes, which is what Newark did. We tried to kind of take an approach to development that said, if you are a new development in the city of Newark, you will be subject to an environmental review process. You will have to disclose what the impacts are to the community and how they might aggravate environmental injustice. And then there were like proactive planning, like California's green zones. They tried to kind of incentivize and attract the kind of development they wanted in their EJ communities. And they also created an overlay zone, which is just like a special district in a couple of EJ neighborhoods. And I think Minneapolis has green zones as well. But in California, that green zone designation meant stricter zoning rules and also incentives for local businesses for the kinds of things they wanted. And then we had folks that targeted specific sources of pollution that they wanted to phase out or non-conforming uses that they wanted to get rid of. So in San Diego, they had a law that was like, how do we phase out auto body shops that are too close to our homes? So they had an ordinance for that. And
Can anyone hear anything?
Yes, I can still hear.
Me too.
hopefully Roxanne can hear us.
I'm sorry.
That's
I got
okay.
I can still hear. We all can still hear. Roxanne's here.
All right. So yeah, the last one is public health codes. Every city has public health codes that they may or may not enforce. I know in Newark, we have 2 public health officers that have to enforce all the public health rules for the city. So it's a stretch, but some communities have invested in their public health code enforcement and strengthening their public health codes so that any development that has like odor or dust or nuisance or anything like that, that they can like crack down on them through the public health codes. And if anybody's interested, I could tell you a little bit more about the EJ ordinance in Newark. It's not the version of the ordinance that we fought for in Newark. We wanted something that was going to force developers to not only do the environmental review, but require more scrutiny from the planning and zoning officers. And what we ended up getting was a more watered down version that's just advisory in nature. Like they do the review, but then the planning board or the zoning board doesn't necessarily have to consider it in their decision making. So it wasn't as strong as we had hoped it would have been, or that our model ordinance was. But the idea that we had was like a three-prong approach, like attack this thing. One was do a new master plan that talks about EJ, right? And our master plan was like wildly out of date. Then redo our zoning, because our zoning was 50 years out of date. I mean, we still have zoning for like where you can like have horses and, I don't know, like crazy stuff. So, we had to redo our zoning. And then 3 was like try to intervene in the development process, which was this new ordinance, right? Like when a development comes to the city for approval, it has to go through this environmental review. So we tried to get at it 3 ways. And one of the most important things we did, to be honest, that was the most impactful, was the strengthening of our zoning. And we worked really closely as community groups to get in the weeds on the zoning code with the planners in the city and say, hey, we want you to prohibit certain uses of stuff we don't want, like sewage sludge, incinerators, things that are already harming our communities. We want to put special conditions on the types of manufacturing that are happening in our neighborhoods. So all of these things we had to like try to weave in and influence in the rezoning process, because on the other side, the developers were trying to like make everything mixed use and basically water down the restrictions on conditions. Like they don't want conditions. They don't want any prohibited uses. They want to have all the flexibility in the world to do, whatever they want. And now more and more, they want to gentrify, right? Like they want to have tons of room to build market rate housing. So things to consider, like the EJ ordinance was good. It could have been better. It could have been stronger, but the zoning was really important. And then we passed an EJ law in the state of New Jersey in 2020. And it was, again, really an effort of building off of what we did in Newark, like trying to get greater strength and protections for our communities to be able to say no. And the EJ law in New Jersey is the first in the country that says to industries, if you come into a community that's already overburdened, then the state must deny your permit on the basis of cumulative impacts. So it doesn't give them any wiggle room, like you may deny it, like maybe it's like you shall deny that permit. And so it is an important step forward in trying to get more protection through the state permitting process. Because sometimes these decisions, they don't happen at the local level. The local level sees the development application, but maybe the industry is getting their air permit from the state. So you got to like try to figure out where can we get them. So this way, the state now has a rule about cumulative impacts that I can tell you more details about if you're curious about that bill. And then I have a bunch of resources. I've talked for too long, so I'm going to stop. And I'm going to share this presentation with everybody so that you all have it with the links and with the slides, and you're free to use it.
Thank you so much. That was super informational and not boring at all. I think actually it's like one of those things where I'm like angry again, where, that's usually the emotion that fuels a lot of my organizing. And so, because what you're saying, so many of these things are in alignment with what's happening in Minneapolis, North Minneapolis, particularly the industrial area right along the Mississippi River, and it's pumping pollution into the air. It's causing cancer, it's causing asthma. And it's infuriating and it's inhumane, really. And so I really want to thank you for sharing your knowledge, and thank you for being so generous to share your slides with us, because I think that it's something that we could really use in our organizing efforts. And so I'm going to take some time, and we have some questions that we wrote beforehand that we'd like to go over. And there's a couple of things that I'd like to touch on that you brought up during your presentation that I found really interesting, that I was hoping that we could kind of circle back on. And then after that, we want to make some space for community to ask their questions as well. So if y'all could bear with us through this process, if you have a burning question, you can either write it in the chat if you don't feel comfortable sharing out loud, or you can share out loud. We would love for you to be able to participate in the conversation. So I think that one of the slides that you brought up was this kind of map that shows these different areas, because we were wondering about what's similar between the different cities. Like I said earlier, right, we're neighbors, but we're not really that close. How is zoning similar? But what are the differences? But it seems like you've touched on that, and you're going to be providing us with the slide that kind of gives us some information as far as like, what can we do? You know, how can we be effective? And so I think that that's helpful. You actually answered a lot of these questions as you were going through. I'm wondering if you can touch on, when you say that zoning is an extension of policing, can you dissect that a little bit and kind of go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so this full disclosure, there's probably folks here who know a lot more about the legal aspects of how municipalities come to have any vested authority. My understanding is that the police powers of local municipalities come under the 14th Amendment Clause, and they basically, it's the part of the laws that basically says that local governance structures, and this isn't just cities, it could be incorporated areas, counties, local governments can self-organize, used to be militias and then local police forces to basically keep the peace and public welfare, maintain the public welfare. And that's how local, you went from having like the federal guards to having like every single municipality has their own police force in the country. And there's all this history about how police forces actually, again, were part of hardening racial lines and racial segregation, particularly post Jim Crow. And the ability of a municipality to dictate private property transactions within its boundaries is delegated police authority, because it's basically like, it's considered like taking someone's property. And so it was sort of put under that category because it had the force and effect of a takings. So and it was upheld with the idea, or with the intent, that it's reasonable seizure of property. In other words, it's reasonable under this idea that you're maintaining public welfare, and that you're providing sort of a social good. But again, the subtext is that in many cases, it was also providing a means for racial segregation too, in some cases. So yeah, I'm sure somebody could do much better service to that history. And maybe there's folks on the call who know more about that history. But it's the reason why it's so powerful and it's so contentious is like, it is people and there's private property rights in the US take that super serious. So anytime any rules that mess with the ability of people to make money off their property, that's what zoning does. I mean, zoning kind of sets the basis for the value of your property and the surrounding properties, and it conditions all the different uses in where you live. So it's pretty powerful stuff.
Wow. Thank you. It's very deep because, we see policing show up in all sorts of ways in our community. And so this is just yet another way where it's like protecting property or profits over people. And so just again, showing up continuously in community. Thank you. One thing I'm curious about, well, for everyone on the call, so what you were saying, which I thought was really helpful to kind of put things into perspective for me, was you've got your master visioning plan, and then you have the rules, which is zoning. And so where we're at in Minneapolis, we've had this master visioning plan, which is the 2040 comp plan. So that process has happened. And I've heard them kind of say, you know, we've done all this engagement, we had 1,000 meetings. But your point to the rules are what's really important. That's where the zoning ordinance comes in. So in real time, this is where we are at in Minneapolis, where now they are changing the zoning. And so I'm gonna have, my brain's kind of everywhere. I'm trying my best to take notes, but I'm wondering, are there other times that we are able to influence the zoning code and zoning ordinances outside of the master visioning and then the rulemaking? And how were you able to keep community members at the table throughout this process when it's something that's kind of like visionary, it happens down the pipeline, and a lot of times we're working with community members that are facing a lot of urgent matters like being evicted, et cetera. So are there other times that we can influence ordinances? And how do you keep community members at the table and active in the fight?
Yeah, really good questions. The zoning of a municipality, you know, sort of typically the full scale rezoning doesn't happen that often. I mean, you know, municipalities don't do that as often probably as they do a master plan or a comprehensive plan. Maybe every 10 years when you do the comprehensive plan, you might do a rezoning. But a citywide, like a massive citywide rezoning is not that frequent. So the opportunity to do that is very infrequent and rare. And I would say it's way more important. This is my own bias. It is more important than the master plan. So I got distracted with I was like, oh, master plan, master plan. I'm like, master plan are just some pretty pictures and some nice words, and they may or may not happen. I mean, I want them to be pretty and I want them to say the right thing, but there's no force of law in a master plan. In other words, if I'm a developer and I go to the planning board and what I say doesn't necessarily match the pretty pictures in the master plan, that doesn't mean anything. But if my plan doesn't match the zoning, then I get turned away. So I really want to emphasize that planning is important, but the zoning is where it's at. I was like talking to a friend who's the ED of ACE in Boston, with Dwayne. He was like, zoning is the black ops of the real estate people. Like they, like it really, like you gotta be paying attention to the zoning. And it's way more technical, right? And it's usually very much in the purview of developers and real estate lawyers and, you know, planners. So it's a hint at like where cities should, you know, focus their efforts. They try to get that under the radar. So, but the rezoning is not the only time that you can mess with the zoning. I mean, back in the bad old days in Newark, we didn't even have a planning department, and zoning happened through something called spot zoning. You would just roll up into the city office and you were a powerful developer and you would work with somebody and you'd literally spot zone. You'd write a marker around an area that you wanted to develop that was residential, and you'd magically turn it into mixed use on the spot. And you'd go to the city council and you'd say, I'm going to approve this spot zoning for this area. Now, spot zoning is bad practice. Usually shouldn't be happening. But there's other ways that you can go and amend the current zoning. You can have special districts or overlay zones. So the green zones, for example, were probably, I don't know if they were introduced as a special overlay or special district, but you can do that, right? You can go to the planning board or the city council and adopt amendments or special overlay zones. So the underlying zoning is the same, but then you add another layer on top of it with additional rules or regulations. So that's another opportunity to amend your zoning. So you can get a couple of bites at the apple with the zoning. You don't have to wait for a big rezone. But if you all have the opportunity in this moment to get in on the ground floor of a rezoning, you want to make sure that it does what you want it to do, because you might not get another chance at it for another decade. So it's important to get in there quickly. Now, how do you get people interested in zoning? Well, that's a good question, because it's hard, you know, like zoning, like you said, can feel really like distant from people's everyday lives, you know, like, why is this the thing I got to go to or pay attention to? Oftentimes there's a lot of organizing that happened, especially with controversial projects that in Newark, we were fighting all the time in the planning board or zoning board. And that organizing that we did with residents that were coming out and testifying against developments, those were the folks that we were talking to about zoning. You know, we were trying to tell them, like, this is all connected. You know, if we don't want to keep being in this pattern where we're forced constantly into being reactive and fighting every development at the planning board, or having things happen we don't even know about it till afterwards. So that organizing has to start like kind of early, and to try to help people connect the dots. And honestly, like, it's great to have some like nerdy friends who like to nerd out on zoning that'll have your back, and and will like accompany residents and help, you know, kind of help with the organizing, and, you know, and some of the like boring bits as you get through, you know. But yeah, it can be done. I know we used to have these workshops with Damon, you know, with the Legos, and we'd show people, like, take people through the zoning process with, you know, with Legos to kind of engage young people, especially. So.
Thank you. I have just two more that are here, and then I want to quickly get over to the chat because the questions are rolling in there, and I definitely want to be able to touch on some of those. I think that it's interesting that you mentioned kind of like particular developments, because that's also something that we're running into with the Upper Harbor Terminal. And so the Polad is like an extremely wealthy family. The Polads are an extremely wealthy family, and they are going to be developing in this area. And one thing that we noticed is that they've already changed some of these ordinances around sound in particular. And, you know, one thing that was mentioned, we met with Damon, who I think that you know earlier, and he said, you know, when businesses want to build something, they learn the rules so that they can figure out how to bend the rules, you know. And so how is it that they are able to, you know, get something like the sound ordinance changed prior to like this kind of public process? Is that just kind of like who you know kind of deal? Or, I mean, you said that it's privy to real estate and to developers. Do you think that is that something that's typical?
It's not typical, but unfortunately happens a lot, like the spot zoning. You know, there are instances where a city might pass an amendment to the zoning, or they can give you, for your specific development that you're requesting, you know, you're requesting something that's not allowed in the zoning. You can go before the zoning board of adjustment. I don't know what they have in Minneapolis, if it's a zoning board of adjustment or something like that, where development applications go that have special requests, or they don't comply with the existing zoning, so they need to get special permission. And so they go to those commissions or boards and they ask for what's called a variance, an exception. And almost always they rubber stamped yes, especially if it's powerful people or people that are, you know, influential, because I don't know, again, I don't know the structure of your planning and zoning commissions in Newark. They're appointed by the mayor and the city council people. So they are not planning professionals. These are not people who know a lot about zoning. They get appointed. They're just, you know, regular people that have their jobs, and they get put on these councils. And they're accountable to the city council people who put them there, or the mayor that put them there. And so because they don't have a lot of expertise in planning or zoning, they may or may not be weighing all the impacts, and they may be easily influenced by politics, right? Not the actual merits of the application before them. And, you know, the important thing to remember too is, so almost always these things go to zoning and they ask for special permission and they get rubber stamped yes, like, oh, you want a variance? Oh, we don't allow this loud zone, you know, this decibel of noise, but in your special case, we'll let it happen. Or you can't have an industry that does X, but we'll let it happen. Then this, so variances get given out all the time. They're supposed to be in New Jersey, and again, I don't know the law enabling the zoning commissions in Minneapolis, but a zoning variance is supposed to be subject to a benefits and burdens consideration. It requires that zoning board to say, what are the benefits to the public welfare and the public good, and what are the burdens? And the benefits must outweigh the burdens. And how they do that, they have a ton of discretion. But legally, if you're a resident and you don't believe that they did the benefits and burdens correctly, you can sue. You can appeal the decision of the zoning board. And in Newark, we have done that on many decisions. We have taken the zoning board to court to challenge and appeal their decisions. And we've won in some cases very successfully. So that's something that you have a lot more power at the zoning board of adjustment where things are, you're asking for a special condition or variance, but it's also wildly subject to politics and political influence. So when we show up to the zoning board with like 300 people that are against the project, all of a sudden the benefits and burdens for those commissioners starts to look like, oh, maybe I should vote no on this because a lot of people are watching me. So
Right.
that's also something to keep in mind.
Okay. So it sounds like that's something to look into and see, because we were just curious, like, how can you do this without public input? And I know a lot of times those notices go out very quietly as far as, hey, this is coming up, and it's quite possible that we haven't heard anything or didn't hear anything about it. So
We
thank
have
you for
somebody
that.
that just monitored the planning and zoning board notices because they would try to sneak things onto the agenda. And, you know, you'd find out about it like 3 days before, you know, to try to organize people to come out to that is really hard. So yeah, monitoring those notices that come out of those boards can be important.
Thank you. The last thing that I will ask before going over to the chat is you touched on cumulative impact ordinances and how that relates to zoning. And I'm just wondering if you can give us a very basic description of what that is, and you know, just kind of what is a cumulative impact ordinance? It's something that is, again, in real time on our plates here.
Yeah, basically cumulative impacts is just a fancy way of saying all the different pollution sources and types of pollution that people are exposed to, right? So it's this cumulative effect of you live near a highway, you live near an industry, you know, maybe, you know, your community has high rates of asthma, like all of those health factors, you know, quality of life issues, pollution burdens, those things in combination create an impact in your community, and we call that cumulative impacts, right? And the ordinance at the municipal level was an attempt to say, hey, you're an industry, you want to come to this neighborhood. Well, first you have to tell us, like, are the existing burdens already there? Like, so the city put out, the city of Newark did a what we call an environmental resource inventory. It's like a baseline, all the different brownfields, highways, facilities, that's the baseline. So like, is the area you're going into, what are the existing burdens already there? And then what are you going to be contributing? And it's like a huge checklist of like all the different things, like how many trucks does your facility have? Is there any air pollution? Do you have permits you have to get? You know, all the different things we could think of on a checklist to ask a developer about what they plan on doing. And then part of our thinking was like, oh, we'll use that as a basis for hopefully like weighing the benefits and burdens at the zoning board, right? So it would be a report we would give to the zoning board and they could use it to say, okay, based on this list of burdens you're going to be contributing, you can't get the variance, you can't get the okay. So, but the ordinance actually turned out to be much more like advisory, like they could look at it, but they don't necessarily have to consider the advice of the review list. At the state level, it's a lot more technical and very like strict. Like there's all these rules for like, there's 23 stressors that the state has data on. They calculate a state average for non-EJ communities. And if you come into an area that is above the state average of the non-EJ communities, then that's considered already an impacted area. And any absolute amount of pollution there is considered a contribution. So it's very strict, it's very technical. But mostly like cities usually stay out of like air permitting things because a lot of the environmental rules are only the jurisdiction of the state. They're not usually allowed, the cities are usually not allowed to get involved in like how much emissions a plant can put out, unless it has to do with like odor, noise, dust, things that relate to like public nuisance. A city can't tell an industry, oh, you have to reduce your emissions by X amount. That's the purview of state regulatory agencies.
Okay. Definitely something that's on the radar of CMEJ. So thank you for that. It sounds like it's for sure worth being on the plate and on the radar. So note to everyone here to come on that. Let's jump into the chat, and I'm trying to go back and catch as many as I can here. So I see a question here from Cassandra M, and she asked, do you know how eminent domain works with zoning, or is that completely separate?
I don't know if I know enough about it. I think eminent domain is different. Usually because it doesn't care about the zoning. It's like, we've got this major infrastructure project and we're going to take your property, irrespective of the zoning. Although I imagine that if you want to put a highway, or if you want to do eminent domain, and like, for example, in Newark, they wanted to do eminent domain in an industrial zone. They tried to use the zoning to show like how the area could be basically primed for different kinds of development. And then they sort of like primed the area with the zoning, like, oh, we want the zoning here to be less intensive because they wanted warehousing to come in. So they kind of used the zoning to prep the area for eminent domain later. But eminent domain was a legal process. They had to go to the courts to try to make a case that those properties in their current state were blighted.
Right.
Public purpose in taking them.
Yeah, and that's interesting because when I was asking about eminent domain, because they say that you can use it to kind of for the government to take back property from a private owner if they're causing harm, or if it's for public good, like, and again, it's like, who makes the rules, who's saying to whose benefit, right? Like, we're going to put this highway here and it's for the benefit of the community. Not always, because whose property are you taking, and so but eminent domain seems to be so sticky. And it, it was kind of like, hey, what about eminent domain? And it was like crickets, so I do think that they are separate, but what's all really separate in these issues? There are intersections. It's just really about finding where. So
I mean, in Boston and Dorchester, they use the mayor used eminent domain to basically turn over a bunch of derelict vacant lots to a community organization for their use to build affordable housing. And that was like a huge deal. That was like the first time that it ever happened. But it's not that it couldn't be done. It's also used to give private property to other private property owners, like developers. That's usually what they do. But there's nothing that says you couldn't actually turn over derelict land actually to the public use for a CDC or a nonprofit or a cooperative to turn it into for public goods.
absolutely. Thank you. I see another question here from Ricardo, and they're asking, Does state or federal government have any power or influence on local zoning rules, specifically as it relates to disparate impacts to communities of color?
States definitely do. So state enabling laws are what enable municipalities to adopt zoning. So, and in many cases, states require a master plan or a comprehensive plan. Not all states, but some states. I don't know in Minnesota if that's a requirement. Yeah. So, but like in Texas, they're like many towns don't have any zoning. They have no plan. And in fact, in Texas, when cities like Austin try to implement bans on fossil fuel infrastructure, the state came down and basically outlawed municipalities from passing any prohibited use zoning or designations in their zoning and land use codes.
Wow.
So in some cases, states are heavily restrict what municipalities can do. But it sounds like in Minnesota, you have the ability through the enabling laws of your constitution that allows municipalities to set their land use laws and zoning.
Thank you. The next question in the chat is from Julia, and they asked, I am curious if you have thoughts on zoning in cities versus smaller cities or rural areas. What are the major differences that you think are important? What are the opportunities for solidarity, especially for facing climate change, etc.?
That's a great question. There are tons of differences in how cities and suburbs and rural areas have historically zoned. And the reality is that cities got the way they got because of what also happened in the suburbs and the rural areas around them. Those things, those dynamics of how racial segregation and land use zoning happened, they happened together, right? Suburbs became, people, they had the white flight, right? Residents leaving city centers to white, wealthier suburbs, and they started to harden their zoning and restrict their zoning. And basically white suburbs were able to kind of exclude all the industrial uses they didn't want. But at the same time, they were specific services that only an industrial zone could meet. So a lot of the regional infrastructure that services suburbs sit in cities and are concentrated in cities. So sewage treatment plants, highways, all the the infrastructure that allows metropolitan areas to thrive often get concentrated in the areas that allow for that type of zoning where suburbs do not. And so there's an increase, there's always been this interest in regional planning and more cooperation between cities and suburbs to come to more of a shared sense of responsibility for, for example, opening up opportunities for affordable housing, sharing the burden of infrastructure that we all need, sort of being less exclusionary in the suburbs, right? And more inclusionary in the cities. Once cities start to restrict, in New Jersey, as soon as we start saying no to industries in the cities that have already gotten too much, you better believe the suburbs are going to be like, uh-oh, not here. All of a sudden, this idea of where things can go and do we really want these things and need them starts to come into focus more. Because right now, EJ communities are sacrifice zones. They're easy dumping grounds for everything that nobody else wants. So I think there needs to, there is a value in doing more regional wide planning and zoning and more solidarity between those areas, and even in rural areas too, right? Where they have special concerns around agriculture and the forms and function of agriculture. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can unpack from that.
For sure. Thank you. Thanks for that question. The next question comes from Michelle, and they ask, how do we get industrial zoning to move from our overburdened communities where the health disparities are the worst in the state to our wealthy white neighborhoods? In other words, how do we get city council to pass such a change?
That's a great question. Bingo, right? Where it's the things that EJ communities have been asked to accept time and again are things that are unfathomable to other communities that they've never had to contend with in their zoning. So it begs the question, like, so I'll give you a perfect example. In New Jersey, we have this proliferation of warehousing and logistics. And for decades, EJ communities have complained about the concentration of high intensity warehousing with thousands of trucks that concentrate in these areas, diesel trucks. And when warehousing started to sprawl out to the suburbs along major highways, all these rural towns and suburban towns started to say, oh no, this is terrible. We have to exclude these things from our zoning. And they started talking about the problem of warehousing. And they're like, these things don't belong here. These are not the right places. They belong in more urban areas. We can't have these things here. And it was sort of a subtle subtext for like racism. It's like, these are okay in your communities, but not in ours. These don't belong here. These are not their natural place to be. And then of course they'll say, that's not what we mean they should be near highways. But in reality, that's what they're saying. And so there was a moment to be like, hey, let's have a conversation, a real honest conversation about if you don't want warehousing and we have too much warehousing, like what is the right amount of warehouse? What's the solidarity approach to tackling that issue? And it's a difficult conversation because every town is sort of every man for himself. Everybody wants to put up walls around their neighborhood and say, not here. And there's a lot of entrenched racism and property value to gain from that, right? Like white communities have benefited from higher property values that they want to protect. So it's not going to be an easy conversation, in other words. But I'll tell you, the best place to start is to make cities and EJ communities better, healthier places for our communities to live. And all of a sudden, when they run out of places to sacrifice, it'll start to become a bigger conversation.
Thank you for that. One of the things that popped into my mind when you said, we don't mean it like that. We mean this belongs near the highways. But then it's like the conversation of who's deciding to put the highways where, you know what I'm saying? So it's like this kind of catch-22 and this never-ending hamster wheel of some nonsense, that really kind of shafts us as communities of color. So that's very enlightening. Thank you for that. The next question comes from Shalini, and she asks, one of the things Minneapolis does as a green city is site recycling, composting, and biochar facilities in these areas and say they are sustainable industry. How did you deal with those? And how do you deal with those when we have a possible negative impact on community, like metal recycling, for example?
Yeah, well, first, you gotta prohibit or condition these uses in your zoning. So biochar, that's more bullshit. That's sludge processing. That's what that is. So when we redid our zoning in Newark in 2017, we put prohibited in all industrial zones, sewage sludge processing. And a company tried to come in and say, no, we're not sewage sludge, we're biochar. No, that's not what we do. And I'm like, what is the material, the raw material that you use? Oh, sludge. Okay, so you're a sludge processing plant. So you really have to get creative about prohibiting all manner of uses especially those uses that you already have a lot of, that you want to stop the flow. Number two is defining, benefits. So in the state law, for example, we were very clear to codify in the rules that a benefit could not be economic benefit. It could not be a benefit to general society or the region or the municipality. It had to be a direct material benefit to the actual host community census block group that the thing was in. And it had to provide a direct environmental or health benefit. So if it didn't do that, it didn't qualify. So if you're a recycling plant and you're providing a service to the whole county or the whole city, that's not a direct benefit to that host community. And the primary purpose of the facility, the way it's defined, does not primarily serve that Black group. It primarily serves usually areas around it. So in the definition of a benefit, we were clear in the definition of a facility. This is where you get real technical, real nerdy. You have to look at how do they define a facility? What are the prohibitions? How do you define a benefit? All of those things set the rules. And they'll still try to get around it because like we defined sewage sludge and they tried to say they were biochar, but we won that fight. But that's an example where you have to get real nitty gritty into the details of defining those things, if not in the zoning code, in the ordinances that you might pass or the EJ law you might pass at the state.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have is from Evan, and he asks, Anna, what about public health? You mentioned zoning can't regulate air emissions, but what about a public health study as a prerequisite for a conditional use? And if the impact in the green zone is too high, then the use would be denied.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could try a public, like some groups have tried a health impact statement as part of the review process, because the zoning, the enabling law, enables public health considerations. So if it stays within the purview of public health, I think you could make a case for including health impact assessments in your review process. I'll just say that sometimes like what we've learned is like anytime we include like studies or data, a lot of the planning and zoning board members just don't have the expertise, or the planners themselves in the city don't have the capacity to really use those things properly. So it requires a lot of oversight and community organizing still to get it through. But I think you could get creative. Definitely a health impact assessment could be part of it. As long as you weren't like dictating the parts per million, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing, getting into the permitting, that I think you'd be safe.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, the next question comes from Scott, and he asks, the city of Minneapolis has passed policies like the green zones and resolutions like declaring racism a public health emergency that are feel-good measures with no enforcement mechanisms. Any examples you know of to leverage these into action, legal or political? It's a good question.
It is a good question. I mean, my tried and true is like follow the money. Like when you look at the budget, where does the budget go? Have there been any carve outs? For example, the green zones, like in California, when I looked at the cleanup, green up, I did look at like, well, how much of the city's resources and planners went into enacting this ordinance. They hired an ombudsman, they hired a planner, they did make some investments, but they still didn't like probably put enough money into help small businesses stay where they are. So, following the money, like if you make a commitment to those things, like where is your budget that matches that? Like, where are you putting the resources to implement that? That's, I would say probably the most direct way.
Yeah, that's real. Money talks and bullshit walks, excuse my language, but all right, next question comes from Mitchell, and he asks, also, West Broadway is an opportunity zone, no capital gains taxes, bunch of incentives for market rate housing, double whamming of new zoning and opportunity zones. How do you mitigate such a seemingly unstoppable force?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And I wish I had a good answer to it because it's a lot. So many communities are facing this, with increased gentrification pressures, the lack of affordable housing. And then you have all this money pouring in and incentives that are just driving those market pressures and destabilizing communities of color, right? these are difficult challenges. I mean, in Newark, one thing we've worked really hard on is to try to stem the tide, not to stop it by any means, but through the inclusionary zoning ordinance, right? To try to require the introduction of significant amounts, not just like symbolic amounts of affordable and very affordable, very low income housing units. And then trying to protect public housing. I don't know in Minneapolis what that looks like, but that's been very important to like not decimating the stock of public housing and trying to rebuild public housing, cooperative housing. Honestly, like if you can't protect housing for people, it's really hard to push back against those market forces. So, you know, a lot of EJ groups, you know, like in Newark, we fought really hard for all these improvements, but if we don't fight equally for the affordable housing investments and some of the public services that we want, then it's going to all be washed away with the gentrification pressures. I mean, and of course the zoning will help with that, right? Like if you allow everything to be upzoned, like when we did our waterfront, they wanted to upzone all the residences along the waterfront, including public housing and HUD housing. And we tried to, in the zoning, protect the designation of public housing and affordable housing in our zoning. So we did not allow them to upzone that to 6 stories, 7 stories. No, we tried to keep it at the existing density, and didn't introduce a lot of mixed use because we didn't want the incursion of a lot of commercial only enterprises. So yeah, there are some tricks in the zoning to help you kind of maintain a zoning that's not going to like explode the market forces.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. I'm noticing too, there was an additional question that kind of came as a follow-up to the eminent domain question. And so I'm sorry about my lag. I'm kind of trying to go in order here, but you know, she was mentioning like the comment about direct benefit to the community, of that including jobs for community members. And so like while we're talking about housing being one of these things, but I think, you know, jobs is definitely something that comes into play. And to answer your question, Cassandra, you know, I don't know if that's something that is like written out as a specific benefit to the community, but it absolutely should be, because we know that those things again are an intersect and they're not exclusive of one another. So thank you for bringing that point up.
I want to give a shout out to Jeremiah who showed up. And I also want to announce to people that the reason why we're bringing people into this conversation is not just because it's happening right now, but it's a good way of bringing people into the work that is needing to be done right now. And we also want to welcome you to support us this year and next year on passing a cumulative impact ordinance at the municipal level. So we're really appreciative of you guys showing up, but we really need you to fill out that form so that we can stay connected with you before you get off.
Yep, so there's been a link. If you, Rose just dropped it again, it's a Google Doc. It's simple, it's 3 questions. If you could please fill that in, and we're just asking for contact information if you'd like to stay included and help us build momentum. Please, please, please fill the survey so we can stay in touch with you. We are getting very close to time. I want to pull up my agenda here. And I seem to have lost it, but I know we've got about 5 minutes left. And we filled this time with answering questions from the chat. Is there anyone else that wanted to ask a question before? I want to definitely make space because I know that that was something that we said. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask Anna before we wrap up for this evening? No.
Maybe a 1-word checkout.
I want to thank her at least though. Thank you. That was amazing information. That was tremendous information. That was amazing. And I think, you know, thank you, Danielle, for the leadership and all the queens who were, I know it's mostly ladies who ran this. I just really want to thank y'all for this information. I can't thank y'all much. This was very powerful. And I just appreciate being able to take y'all lead.
Thank you, Drew. We could do a rapid round, one word checkout. And if you want to add it in the chat, you can do that. Otherwise, come off mic and let's do it. We've got about 4 minutes left. I'm going to start. I'm feeling fired up.
Oh,
Inspired.
oh, that's sorry, but the presentation link. I just noticed someone asked about that. Is it in the chat? Because I don't see it anywhere.
No, I haven't put it in there yet. I'm going to do that right. I'm gonna try to do that now.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. That's another way too for us to be sure to get you the presentation if we have your email. And I think we do because everyone has registered. I'm seeing grateful, I'm seeing connected, I'm seeing informed, I'm seeing powerful, informational, ill but engaged. So some really enlightening, blessed, filled, really positive feedback, thankful of how people are feeling tonight. And I'm resonating with all of these. Curious, that's great. How you feeling, Roxanne?
I just want to say I'm so thankful for my team. Y'all, they came through for me. And this is probably the second meeting ever in 4 years that I have not led. So it's really a wonderful thing to see so many amazing people join us today. But I'm just hoping that y'all can give a shout out to my team because they really held it down. So thank y'all.
Thank you. I'm laughing at Laura's comment. She wants to say charged up, not charged, because that sounds like illegal, like a legal thing. The presentation is in the link. Thank you, team. Thank you, Roxanne and Shalini. Brilliant women who are pulling things together. Thank you to CMEJ, y'all. And
Yes, thank you, Dr. Anna Baptista. Thank you.
yes, thank you so much for coming in from the East Coast to share all of your knowledge with us. We really appreciate it, and we hope to be able to stay connected as we fight the good fight. And think of us as your Midwest allies for sure.
Think of us also as a partner in your struggles there. You know, definitely feel free to call on us in Newark to support you and lift you up as you begin this journey or continue this journey, really. So we're with you, and yeah, wishing you all the best.
Thank you. All right, y'all. Once again, the link to the surveys in the chat. Please feel free. Kristen, I see your comment. You missed the beginning. This is recorded and we can send it to you. Please follow up with the chat so that we can follow up with the survey that's linked in the chat so that we can stay connected with you. We do have a link to the presentation as well as this video is recorded so that you can catch up on what you missed. Other than that, it's 8 o'clock, y'all. So to be respectful of your time, thank you so much for spending your evening with us. We appreciate you. And in solidarity, have a great night.
Good night, everybody.
Good